Good afternoon. I hope you guys have had a great Monday so far. This lesson is about Jeremy, the Pigeon war hero of World War I. If you'll note, it says that somewhere in here that this is a narrative nonfiction, which means that it is a true story, but it does have some story elements where you sort of feel like you're in something with some plot and some climax and resolution, etc. I also wanted to go ahead and point out to you that cher ami is a French name. Cher means dear and ami means friend, and so that's kind of how they came to think of this bird. That was her name because she was a dear friend and lifesaver to the soldiers during World War I. Okay, so as noted, it says, as you read, during World War I, what was life like on the battlefield? So this kind of correlates to social studies because we will be moving into World War I next week. At the beginning, it says, I'm going to not read the whole thing to you, but I do want to sort of set the stage here because that's what the author does in this first paragraph. The American soldiers were doomed. It was October 1918, not long before the end of World War I. This, as in World War I, was a more brutal war than any before in history, leaving 17 million people dead and pulling more than 135 countries into it, including the U.S., into battlegrounds all over the globe. Henceforth, that's why it's called World War I. So you now know we're in October 1918 and that we are in the middle of World War I. This paragraph tells you exactly where we were when the story takes place in northeastern France. Okay. And somewhere in here it goes on to tell you in this place called the Argonne Forest, which is mentioned right here. Now, these are American troops. Let's make sure that we're understanding because I was a little confused about certain facts that it doesn't really clarify very well in my opinion. But the American troops are in Argonne, France, okay? And we obviously are fighting with the French, okay, against Germany. And if you look at the map, although you can't really see it very well in the picture, the red powers are the Allied powers, including France and the United States. And over here, you can see we're fighting primarily against Germany, which would have been one of the Central Powers. Okay, so it gives you the scenario that we're in this Argonne Forest in France, and pretty much at this stage, the American troops are getting whooped. Okay. And they need to get a message back to their commanders at headquarters, which of course is 25 miles away. So what options would you think that they might have had? Well, it goes on here to mention the possibility of walkie-talkies and cell phones and emails and army radios, but we didn't have walkie-talkies or cell phones in 1918 and no emails for computers. And unfortunately, at this point, the army radios were not working. So what is it that they turned to for help with communicating this message out? Okay. And it says that they turned to one brave warrior who had been trained for a moment exactly like this. She takes off with the message on a life and death race across the forest, and her name was Jeremy, and she was not a soldier. Of course, we talked about that at the beginning of this. She was not human. She was a pigeon. So shockingly, something I was not aware of before I'd read this article was that pigeons were used to transfer messages to headquarters during World War I. All right, so again, cher ami, as mentioned, French for dear friends, was one of thousands of pigeons that they relied upon during World War I. So she was not a standalone; she was one of many. And the pigeon breed that they used became to be known as a carrier pigeon or a homing pigeon. Okay, so what do you think a homing pigeon is? Well, obviously they are going to be able to zero in on their home. Okay, so in this next little section, okay, why were these pigeons chosen by the military? And I'm not going to go into all the details because I'm not going to read the article for you, but here we focus on what exactly makes the pigeon, okay, such an impressive specimen for carrying messages. Okay, I am going to touch on some of the vocabulary words that you guys are dealing with this week, particularly this one. Pigeons, particularly the carrier pigeons or the homing pigeons, have this innate ability to return to their home nest, no matter how far that they are away from the home nest. Internally, they are born with this ability to track and figure out, no matter where they are, how that they can get home. So why would that make these pigeons great for carrying messages back to home or headquarters? Well, they always know how to get there, and they never ever get lost. And they have this innate ability, which means they were sort of born with this intuition, something that they didn't have to be taught. Okay, so these humble gray birds can travel over seas and mountains across hundreds of twisting and turning miles, and they almost never get lost. They have exceptional navigational powers. Humble meaning here that they are dependable, and they keep it steady, and they very rarely, lose track. In another word here, navigational, your ability to get around from point to point. Okay, so it's important to note here that they had to be trained to figure out where the home nest was going to be. So they did have to actually work with the pigeons to establish that first location called the home nest. And from here on out, wherever they took the bird, it would always know how to get back to that home nest. Okay, when you wanted to send a message, you would write it on a piece of paper, place it in a pinky-sized metal tube attached to the leg of the pigeon, release the pigeon, and it would carry the message back to the home nest. Okay, now we're going to get away from the story just a little bit here and talk about the harshness, the brutality of World War I. Okay, I guess, but before we do that, we need to spend a bit of time talking about the importance of the pigeon in previous times, and that's what this section talks about. So it talks about various people and the careers that they were in, which utilized the pigeon. And even in the first Olympics, they utilized pigeons as message carriers. So not going to read that for you. Okay, so we're talking early 1900s. World War I. In the 1800s, the article mentions some of the new technologies that were invented, such as the telegraph and the telephone. And so, again, there were these options for communication at the time, but the problem here, but there's your clue that there's going to be a problem. In wartime, getting information across long distances was still difficult, especially during battles. Okay, and again, as promised, we're going to talk about some of the new technologies that were specifically related to World War I. And of course, it was, until World War II, obviously, the biggest and bloodiest battle that the world had ever seen, mostly because of the technology that we had developed because of the Industrial Revolution. So we had new things such as machine guns and poison gas and grenades, and for the first time, tanks. So with the access to these new technologies, killing, unfortunately, becomes an easy thing to do. However, in this particular case, we're still going to rely on that pigeon because none of the technologies that were mentioned, such as the telegraph and the telephone, related to communication, that is, were as reliable as this pigeon. Okay, now the next section, fear and bats. Let's get a little brief intro about Cherami. She was born in England, okay, trained by one of the most famous pigeon experts within the country and brought over to France to help out. And obviously, we're talking about the beginning of the story and where we are set. This American army has headquarters near the edge of the Argonne Forest in France. Okay, now focusing on this paragraph again, not reading a lot of it to you, it's going to talk to you about a compare and contrast section of what the Argonne Forest was and then what it had turned into towards the end of the war in France. Okay, and it's going to be particularly notable, just like many other battlefields and battle lines as they were drawn, they were divided up with one troop and another troop a few, probably 100 yards apart. Okay, and each of the troops and the battalions had dug out and created something called a trench. And here we have definition of trench. Okay, again, not reading all of this to you because that's your job. I've already read it. Here's a discussion in this particular paragraph of trench warfare. Okay, and why, the question is, would they need to stay in the trenches? And I think you should be able to answer that. It should be pretty obvious, but notable is that the men didn't just fight in the trenches, they lived in the trenches 24 hours a day. And again, as you continue to read, you're going to learn about the negative aspects of living in the trench. And I will leave that to you. Okay, so now we're learning about life in the trenches. We've learned a little bit about Cherami. Let's go back here to Cherami. Okay, and in the story that we are telling about her mission, we get only one person's name. Okay, and that is the person who was in charge of the battalion that was being whooped up on in the Argonne Forest. The man in charge, of course, his name was Major Charles Whittlesey, and he had been led to lead his troops into an attack of the Germans in the Argonne Forest. Now, notable is that Cher-Ami was one of 8 pigeons brought on the mission. And it discusses how that Cher-Ami was taken care of in that section. Okay, so we're going back to that little gotcha, catch your attention section at the beginning. It's October 3rd. Whittlesey's men marched into the path of a large German force, and they were surrounded and being fiercely attacked. Okay, like I said, I like that little phrase, they were being whipped up on pretty badly. So this paragraph here, and as we go up to this next section of the page, talks about just how bad the circumstances were in the trench and during this particular battle. Okay, more description here about the battle. Notable, with each passing hour, more men were killed or wounded. And so he had those pigeons and he was utilizing those pigeons. Okay, he kept sending out here desperate messages, requests for help to the headquarters. Okay, but the problem is, it says one by one the pigeons were shot or disappeared. So was he making any progress about getting his message back? No. He needed some desperate help. He was bogged down, and his pigeons were being shot or disappearing before he knew that they had had a chance to get the message back to headquarters. So we move on to the 4th of October, and the next day, yay, here we are. Very important here. Finally, the next day, American planes appeared overhead, and of course, what did they think? Our supplies, our backup have come to save the day. Okay, important here to note. But, and when we see that word in any kind of story, usually that means there's going to be some drama, some kind of problem. So they think their day has been saved, but it wasn't food and bullets that those planes were dropping, like he thought once he spotted them that they would be. So now what's going on here? Okay, what happens is that these American troops that are flying over the head are dropping bombs. Now listen, this is important. They were dropping bombs on the American troops. This is important. Okay, so Whittlesey understood with horror that the Americans didn't realize that he and his men were in this part of the forest, so that the bombs that were meant for the Germans were not hitting the Germans, but they were actually being targeted by the American troops. So the American troops are unknowingly killing American troops. So he has to keep going back to the idea of, I've got to get some information about this and our presence and whereabouts in this message back to headquarters. And so I've got to go back to my pigeons. Now remember, if they didn't have any computers, would they have had any kind of GPS? Obviously not. So headquarters, you know, other than a phone call, if they could get one, or if they could get a message to them through the pigeon, headquarters might know their location, but at this point they did not. Okay, so he frantically, because he's really in a panicked hurry, scrawls a message announcing the location of the troops in the woods, letting them know, hello, this is what he says: for heaven's sake, stop this because you're bombing your friends. Now, here we go back to Jeremy, and specifically her contribution to this mission. So by the time he had gotten to this stage where he was scribbling his message, heaven's sake, stop it, only 2 pigeons were left. He had gone through his other 6, Jeremy and 1 other pigeon. So he first pulls out the other pigeon, and we don't obviously know this pigeon's name because it hasn't claimed the fame that Jeremy has. But the bird was so terrified here that it flapped away before the message could be placed into the tube. And so he has to now go to his last resort, which of course is Jeremy. Not going to read this part to you because it describes her mission and how she achieved it and the complications that arose as she was trying to make it back to headquarters. So, bottom line is World War I ended 5 weeks after the last flight of Jeremy. Okay, and we, from looking at some of the information that was covered in the article, understand just how terrible this war was. But let's keep it on a positive note and focus on the heroic act of Jeremy. Okay, so that should be a good little run through to help you understand the story once you have read through it, and hopefully that was a good little review. There are other sections and pictures and captions within this article that you will need to review that I did not cover. And basically, these little subsections with captions talk about the value of different animals in warfare. And I did ask you some questions about some of the pictures and the captions related to the animals. So please make sure that you read those because you'll have a little matching activity as part of the work in one of your quizzes that you take this week. All right. Thanks for your time, and I hope this helped. Bye, guys.